In today's episode of 18th Century Cooking, we are going to be digging into this very popular method of food preservation in the 18th century, and that is called potting. It's something that was done in kitchens in the 18th century all the time. The cookbooks are filled with recipes for potting different sorts of things, generally meats, fish, and sometimes even vegetables. And even though it was done all the time in the 18th century, today we don't use this same method of food preservation. It's been replaced by canning, either canning in an everyday kitchen or sort of industrial canning. So what we're going to end up with today is something very similar to this salmon that has been canned. Now, many of these recipes are specifically for, like, say, salmon or lobster or different sorts of meats. This particular recipe out of Mrs. Fraser's cookbook is just for potting any sort of fish. It says, scrape and clean them well, cut them into middling pieces, season with salt and spices, pack them close up in a potting can with plenty of butter above and below. Tie some folds of coarse paper on the pot, then put them into a slow oven, so not too hot. And when they are enough fired, or cooked in this case, take them out of the can, drain them well from their liquor, let both cool, put the fish into small white pots, skim all the butter off of the liquor, then take some more butter, along with that you take from the liquor, melt it down, pour it on the fish, and then it ends with, this is kind of curious, send in the pots to the table. Now this kind of referenced the idea that this finished thing would basically go right to the table. Generally though, this is a food preservation method, and you'll see some of these recipes say, when you do this, this might last up to a year in its little cooking vessel. Let's get right into the recipe here. We've got a couple pieces of salmon fillets. We're gonna cut this down to the size that's gonna fit into our potting dish. Because of course, we're gonna cook these once and then they're actually gonna go back into our potting dish. So we know kind of the size they need to be. We're gonna salt and pepper these first, cut them in half so that they will fit in this particular pot well. We're gonna butter the inside of it well, and then put in a small layer of butter in the bottom. Lay our pieces of salmon on top, a little bit more butter up on top of those, and then this is gonna go in the oven. Most of these recipes actually call for covering this dish in the oven, or how it's being baked, with paper. We're gonna take brown paper, cover our dish, tie that over the top, and that's gonna seal in the flavors and the moisture. We don't want this to dry out. We don't wanna lose those wonderful flavors. In it goes to the oven, and again, she called for a slow oven, so we're gonna bake this at 325 degrees. We're gonna bake this in a Dutch oven. So our potted salmon is in the oven baking right now, and I thought I would talk a little bit more about potting. So again, they potted all sorts of meats and vegetables, and we have done potted beef before, wonderful episode. They would pot brawn, they would pot venison, and even something like poultry. Imagine small birds, they would pot whole. So you would have like a whole woodcock or something, sealed up in your little potting dish. They also potted vegetables and things like mushrooms. Not only that, but they potted butter itself. I'm not sure exactly how you pot butter. Maybe you pack it in there, and then you pour clarified butter on top and you hope it doesn't melt it. I don't know exactly how potted butter worked, but they certainly potted butter. Now, where did this come from? Now, generally it's thought that they used crusts, like big pie crusts, to do a meat preservation method, and we've covered that also in the past. They would take the top off of these pies after they baked them, pour clarified butter in them, and set that top back on and save that back for later. It might last up to a month. I think there was then a evolution where the crust disappears and is just replaced by this potting dish. So it kind of saved a bunch of effort and shortcut the whole system. So you generally see this potting method showing up in the very early 17th century, and by the 18th century, it is a very popular method. In the 18th century, one of the most common things that you would find that you would be able to buy in the store is potted char, which is a special kind of freshwater fish that was available in England at the time. And I've got this wonderful reference. It is from 1738, so it's a fairly early reference. And this is the Duke of Montague, and he is writing a Mr. Atkinson. He says that I received yours of the first of this month, your package, and also the pot of char, which you sent by that day's courier, which was the best I ever ate. And I would have you send me some of the same sort by every carrier. Take care to pick the henfish and those that are of the red kind, and let them be potted and seasoned just as that pot was, for it can't be better. That's what the Duke of Montague thought about potted char in the 18th century. Let's take our salmon out of the oven. Our salmon has been in this Dutch oven for 35 minutes. We need to take this out of the Dutch oven. We want to be very careful though, because we have liquid butter right at the top, so it's got to stay level. Now we're going to take the salmon out carefully. We've let this cool so I can get in there with my fingers because it might want to break up. We want to keep these into fairly large pieces. We're going to take this out of our dish, set it aside on a plate to cool. We're going to recover this butter. We're not going to just throw this out. We're going to leave the drippings down in the bottom. That's the part we want to leave behind because that's the preservation part. This is the part that will go bad. So we're going to leave all those solids down in the bottom of that and pour off our liquid butter, our clarified butter in this case, and pour that into our pipkin of butter that we are clarifying so that we can top this up. We're going to seal the top with butter. And real quick, let's talk about clarifying butter here. To have this be preserved, for this butter to stay good at room temperature, we need to remove all the milk solids and all the water from our butter. So clarifying it, we melt that butter and all these milk solids will fall to the bottom. That's the part that goes bad on butter, that part that goes rancid. If any sort of froth floats to the top, we don't want that either. What we want is that nice golden oil. That's the good part. That's what's going to stay good at room temperature for a long time. Our salmon has sat overnight. The clarified butter totally solidified. It's pretty cool here in the kitchen. So nice and hard. I peeled off a section of it so we can get to the meat that's down underneath so we can try it out. So let's find out just how this salmon turned out. So moist and creamy, set up in this way. Still have that wonderful salmon flavor. You know, there's that little bit of salt and pepper, and we could have spiced it a little bit more. The recipes call for different kinds of spicing here, and this spice is part of the preservation that's going on with this. But we still have just amazing flavor, and the texture is perfect when it's sort of sealed up in this manner. Just so good. And I mean, all that butter there doesn't hurt it at all. This is a really interesting dish because of its texture and the different kind of ways you can use it. This is so creamy, as I was saying earlier, that you could easily spread it on a piece of bread or on crackers or something like that, which they would have done in the 18th century. This is something that was eaten cool or cold. It's like a snack or a special part of the meal where you're looking for something different. You've had, you've already had the main dish and you want this little finish dish that you can just kind of peck on, or something that you would just kind of dip into at a different part of the day. So you might eat on this all day long, just sort of snack on it. Really, really interesting dish. One of the things that shows up in many of these potted dishes is the texture. Whether if it's a meat that has a much tougher texture, like potted beef, then that's ground till it's very, very soft, like a pate. The fish here has a natural tendency to get soft like that, so we didn't have to pound it up. And then there are some other dishes like potted lamprey that are almost gelatinous when they're done. So everything is supposed to be this sort of almost spreadable form. This is a perfect example of something that you would read in a cookbook and you can't really understand it. You don't really know what's going on with it. It doesn't really explain itself until you actually get a chance to do it. That's what's fun here with this 18th century cooking, is we get to experience it, cook those things up, and then taste them. Such an interesting experiment.